Welcome back. We are all friends living and breathing in community here at the Responsive Nonprofit Summit. So we called an audible, and I thought I'd invite Tim back up to introduce our next speaker.
Hey, thanks. I'm really excited to introduce Dave Raley, who is here to talk about where innovation goes wrong. And I'm excited because I've just gotten to know Dave over the last few days, and I'm excited for what you're going to learn from him. He is the CEO and founder of Imago Consulting, and he's here to talk about where innovation goes wrong. Welcome to the stage, and please join me in welcoming Dave Raley.
Woo!
Thank you, guys. Thank you. I have a question for you. What do you think about when you hear the word innovation? Just take a minute, put it in the chat. What's a word or a phrase or something that comes to mind when you think about innovation? What's the first thing that you think about? Today, we're going to talk about 4 key myths that leaders believe that cause them and hold them back from being innovative, and how to flip those myths and leverage those to create growth. Before we do, there's an immutable law that I want to talk about that every organization, every nonprofit, every person goes through, and that's the organizational life cycle. Every organization starts out in infancy, trying to figure out what it's going to do, how it's going to make a difference in the world. And over time, inevitably, that organization moves through stages of growth, slowing, plateauing, and decline. And this is something I've been in this world working with nonprofits for almost 20 years now, and I've seen this time and time again. The good news is that not every organization, not every program is fixed on this path. There are opportunities to create innovation and growth and what we call new S-curves. If you think about the companies in this world, if Apple Computer was selling the same devices that it was selling in the 1980s and 1990s, it would not be the thriving, growing, successful company that it is today. So that's one of the reasons why I believe that innovation is so important, and it's something that we can learn from. But let's talk about a couple things that hold innovation back. The essence of innovation is ultimately creating new value for others. And so 4 things that cause innovation to go wrong. The first myth that leaders tend to believe about innovation is that innovation is about ideas. So imagine a spectrum. If you have on one end of the spectrum the realm of ideas, new ways of thinking, new paradigms, new approaches, new ways of approaching things. In the middle of the spectrum, you have people that may or may not be the ones that come up with the new idea or the new paradigm, but these are the folks that love to actually bring those ideas to life. They love to build bridges, to land planes. Still, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the realm of getting stuff done, getting the to-do list checked off, pushing through the barriers that inevitably arise to actually being able to implement the ideas that you have. Do you resonate? Do you find yourself resonating on one part of this spectrum or another? Or maybe you feel torn. Maybe you love the realm of ideas, but you also love your to-do list. You love to get things done. You love to optimize and take things to the next level. There's a model that I believe is really helpful when it comes to innovation and moving from this myth that ideas are the center of innovation to realizing that the truth is that innovation is about ideas, but it's also about activation and it's about execution. So I want to talk about this guy for a little bit. Some of you might know who this is. This is Patrick Lencioni. He's an author and a speaker, and he and his team at a company called The Table Group 2 years ago developed a model that I believe is foundational to being able to create a thriving, growing culture and organization. That model is called the 6 Types of Working Genius. I'm fired up about it, that I've become certified in this, and this is something that I take teams through that I work with in opportunities to create innovation, new products, new growth. And the 6 Types of Working Genius is basically the idea is that there are 6 types of work that we must do in order to get the work done that we need to do. There are only 6 types of work, and really every job that we have requires one of these 6 types of work. There's no job that has none of these 6 types of work, but we are made with the skill sets and the giftings of having some of these as our core geniuses. So the basic premise, and I'm going to just bring you through it briefly because I think it's really instrumental and helpful to leading innovation, is that 2 of the 6, for any one of us, 2 of these 6 geniuses are really what are called our geniuses. These are the things that we're good at, we're made for, we get a lot of energy that come naturally to us. 2 of the 6 then are what are known as our working competencies. These are things that we might be pretty good at. We might even be really good at it, but they don't necessarily light our fire. They're not the reason we do what we do. The third area are called our working frustrations. Now, these are 2 things that we may not be good at all, or maybe are just a drain for us. I think folks we find that are in their executive roles have often learned to compensate, and so there may not be any of these things that you're not good at. You may have learned to compensate, but they're ultimately not the things that drive you. So I'm going to walk through them really briefly and show how we moved from the realm of ideas to the realm of activation, and then ultimately to execution. And helpfully spells the word widget. The first genius in the working genius model is the genius of wonder. People with the genius of wonder constantly are asking questions and thinking about, is this the best way we can do things? Is there an opportunity in the market here? Are we really doing the right things? People with the genius of wonder are great at asking questions. The next genius is the genius of invention. The genius of invention is all about coming up with ideas. So if somebody with the genius of wonder says, I wonder if there isn't a better way of doing this, somebody with the genius of invention will say, yes, pick me, I've got 20 ideas. People with the genius of invention love a blank whiteboard. They love the chance to invent, to create, to come up with ideas. Some of you are listening to me right now and you're thinking, yes, Dave, I love to invent. Bring it on. And some of you are listening to this and you're saying, a whiteboard, a blank whiteboard is my idea of torture. Like, don't make me do that, right? The third type of working genius is the genius of discernment. The genius of discernment is all about good gut feel and judgment. These are people that may listen to an inventor and they are really good at saying, you know what, that needs a little more time in the oven, or I'm not sure that's the right thing. But these are the kinds of people that you approach when you have an idea and you want their discernment, you want that judgment. The fourth type of working genius is the genius of galvanizing. And the genius of galvanizing is all around rallying the troops to act. It's about getting people to move and getting them to take action. It's about, hey, everybody, this is the destination. Come and follow me. We're going to go and take that hill. We're going to achieve that destination. The fifth type of working genius is the genius of enablement. Now, some people hear the word enablement and they think, is that a good thing? Like, should I be enabling others? I think there's a lot of connotation that comes with the idea of enablement, but it is absolutely a genius. These are people that respond to the call to action, that say, I love that idea. I think it's the right idea. How can I help? How can we actually pull this off? And organizations thrive when they have people with the genius of enablement. The last genius in the working genius model is the genius of tenacity, and that is the genius of getting things done. People that have the genius of tenacity love pushing through barriers, high standards of excellence, getting stuff done. And if you've worked on any team where you lack the genius of tenacity, you can feel it, because it's like, man, we talk a lot, we brainstorm a lot, we discern a lot, but ultimately, are we actually pushing through the difficulties to get things done? And so on any given team, in any innovative effort, you need all 6 of these types of working genius. And one of the things I love to do is to help teams to see how they might have gaps on their team in the areas of working genius, but they also might be stacked. Some teams can rely on one genius too much. And so when you understand that innovation is not just about ideas, it's about activation and about execution, then you have the opportunity to actually identify problem spots in what hold your organization back from innovation. So if you think about this in phases, really the first 2 geniuses, the genius of wonder and invention, are about ideation. It's about asking questions and coming up with ideas. The geniuses of discernment and galvanizing are about activating. and the geniuses of enablement and tenacity are about implementing those ideas. The reality is, when you look at your own working geniuses, and I highly recommend checking out the working genius model and taking the test or reading the book, there are people that have geniuses that are at opposite ends of the spectrum. So it's not that we're just stacked on one end of the spectrum or we're just stacked on the other end of the spectrum. In fact, I think a lot of people have felt torn in their lives because, for example, they might have the genius of wonder, but also the genius of enablement. And they may feel like at times, I feel like I'm, sort of head in the clouds and I'm constantly thinking about what could be or what should be, but then I absolutely just want to help and make things happen. So highly, highly recommend it. It's a model that I think helps reduce unnecessary guilt and helps teams to function better, because when you realize that somebody on your team has a genius that you don't have, then that moves from a point of contention, honestly, sometimes, to a point of reliance, to say, how can I rely on my team members that have this genius? So the first myth of innovation is that innovation is about ideas. The truth is that innovation is about ideas, it's about activation, and it's about execution. So I want you to reflect for a moment, and then we'll move on to our next myth. What are your strengths? What are your geniuses? What are your team's strengths? And I don't mean just universally. I mean, what do each individual member of your team bring to the table? And where do you need to focus? Where might you be over-reliant on a specific type of work? And where might you have gaps? And there are a lot of things you can do to fill those gaps. That's something that, if we go a little bit deeper, we can dive into. But I want to take us to our next myth of innovation. So myth number 2 of innovation is that innovation is new. Have you believed this one? This is something that I believed for many, many years, because there's just something about even the word innovation. If it wasn't invented in the last 2 years, is it really innovative, right? If it doesn't have technology or digital behind it, is it really innovative? But the reality is, I spent a lot of time studying people throughout history, people like Leonardo da Vinci, like Filippo Brunelleschi, like Martin Luther, people that lived hundreds of years ago. And I started to notice that these people were absolutely innovators in their time. And I think there are some lessons that we can learn from ancient history that we can apply to our innovation efforts today. So the truth is that innovation is not new. Innovation is ancient. Innovation is something that we can look back, and I would argue, looking back further in history, can glean some of the more pressing lessons that we can learn to apply to innovation today, because I would argue that innovation isn't innovation unless it makes a lasting impact. So it's really hard to tell that something that was invented a year or two ago is really going to make a lasting impact. It may seem like a big deal today, but in the grand scheme of history, is it really a big deal? So I want to share 3 lessons that we can actually learn from the life of one of these figures, Martin Luther. So Martin Luther in the year 1522, so literally 501 years ago, was sitting in this room, and he was doing something that I believe should go down in history as one of the most impactful, innovative acts of his life. And most people don't talk about this. Most people, in the case of Martin Luther, think about nailing the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. But this is when Luther was in hiding several years later. And what he did in this room in September of 1522 was he translated the Christian Bible into Common German. Doesn't seem very innovative. I don't know about you, but it's like, well, I thought it was about technology and about, big, bold moves. Well, the big, bold thing that Martin Luther did was, at the time, the Bible was only available in the academic language of Latin or in the original languages of Greek and Hebrew. So if you were a common German citizen, you did not have access to this information except through somebody else. And Martin Luther was a passionate man, and he felt like that was a problem. And so what he did in September of 1522 was he translated the Bible into Common German, which I believe was one of the most impactful things that he did in his life. Whether you agree or not, the one thing that we agree with, that we can agree on, I think, with Martin Luther is that he made a significant impact on history. So what are some lessons that we can learn in terms of how we can apply to innovation today? The first lesson is that innovation starts with purpose. I think so often innovation can be about getting caught up in the latest and greatest, the technology, the newest fad. How can we apply this particular technology? I remember QR codes a few years ago. You're going to see some QR codes later, but QR codes were just like, we've got to use QR codes no matter what. But the reality is, it's not about chasing fads or chasing innovative efforts or technology. It's about what is the driving purpose that you have to drive the way you do things. So for Martin Luther, it was this driving belief that there were practices that he didn't agree with and that he wanted to get the idea of the Bible into the people's hands. And so that was his driving purpose. That is why he used innovative technology like the printing press. That is why he made bold decisions like translating the Bible into common German, was because of his driving purpose. So the lesson I think we can take away here is that it all starts with purpose. That innovation for innovation's sake, or just to be on the latest bandwagon, is not ultimately going to stick. Because you and I both know that innovation is difficult. It's hard. There are difficult times. And unless we're driven by purpose, then we're not going to make a lasting change. The second lesson I think we can learn from ancient history is that innovation requires collaboration. It's so interesting, even as I mentioned some of the names earlier, Leonardo da Vinci, Filippo Brunelleschi, Martin Luther, these are people that get an inordinate amount of credit for the innovative acts that they led. And the reality is none of those individuals were the only people that were involved. I think we see people like Steve Jobs today and we think, oh man, or Elon Musk is I think the most recent one. Man, he's such a genius. And the reality is, yes, these guys are smart, they are driven, but they are surrounded with people that are bringing their gifts and that are ultimately making that innovation happen. So I want to just tell a brief story. There's 3 individuals among many that were very influential in Germany in the 1500s. And that were contemporaries of Martin Luther. I'm just going to tell a story about Lucas Cranach, the second individual here. Lucas was an artist and an entrepreneur. And Lucas was originally basically the court artist for Frederick the Wise, the patron of that area. So Lucas was an artist, but more than an artist, one of the things that Lucas did was known for was that he was a prolific creator of art. He could create pieces of art faster than anybody in that area. And in fact, he was actually kind of mocked because of that, because in the art world in the 1500s, you would have artists that would work for years or even decades on a single piece of art. And so being quick with art was not exactly something that was appreciated among his peers. But he was prolific. The other thing was he was fascinated with new art technology. And in that day, there was this idea of a woodcut print. So Lucas mastered the ability to create these vivid images using woodcuts. And the reason that was so impactful in that time, in Martin Luther's day, was because woodcuts were the main technology that was used to mass produce art. So can you imagine a bookseller's stall in 1522 covered with books, all completely text, just walls of text. And then you saw a piece that had a cover from Lucas Cranach on it with a vivid imagery. Talk about good marketing. It would stand out. And so Lucas used his art skills to innovate. The other thing that Lucas did was he was an entrepreneur and an investor. He could see that printing and the technology of the printing press was going to be hugely beneficial to the people of Wittenberg and the people of Germany. So he actually invested in purchasing and building production capacity. He built paper mills outside of the town of Wittenberg. Without Lucas Cranach, we would have never heard of Martin Luther. Without any of the other individuals that I've got up here on the screen, we would not have heard of Martin Luther. And so don't believe the myth of the lone innovator. None of us are an innovator alone. We've got to identify who we need around us. And every one of us needs to lean into collaboration. That's one of the reasons why I believe that the Responsive Nonprofit Summit is such a powerful opportunity for collaboration, because I hope you're not just taking lessons and getting notes, but I hope you're meeting people. I hope you're meeting people in the comments. I hope you're connecting with speakers or panelists, because the real place where innovation happens is in community and in collaboration. The last lesson we can learn from the ancient history about innovation that I'll share today is that innovation leverages context. What do I mean by that? I mean that we are all surrounded by what I call natural resources. And so, what are the natural resources that you were given? In the case of Martin Luther, he was born at a very specific time in history. The printing press, which we think of as a new technology in his time, was actually not new. The printing press was invented 65 years before the picture in the room that I shared earlier. So the printing press had just become mature enough to be leveraged as a technology to drive Luther's message forward. If he was born 20 years earlier or 20 years later, we may not have seen the same impact. So in your organization, in your lifetime, you've got to think about what your organization's natural set of resources are. What are the skill sets that you have? What heritage do you have? What founder's legacy are you working from? And how can you leverage that to drive innovation? So innovation starts with a purpose. Innovation requires collaboration. And innovation leverages context. Those are just a couple of the lessons I think we can learn from looking back several hundred years and learning from people who were creating innovation and opportunities. All right, we're on the home stretch now. We've talked about how innovation is new and moving to the truth that innovation is ancient. The third myth that we'll cover in just a minute, but first I want to talk about just a couple things you can reflect on as you think about your lessons in innovation. The first is, what's your purpose? What's your organization's purpose? Do you just need to be reminded of that? It's so easy to just, assume that. What's your context and who do you need around you? So the third myth of innovation is that innovation happens when times are good. I think there's just something that is so easy to fall into, and that is, once I put all those fires out, once I, take care of that crisis that's going on right now, then we will totally be able to, spend the time and invest the time in creating new things and finding new ways of doing things. But the truth is that if necessity is the mother of invention, then crisis is the mother of innovation. And so the reality is that most innovation does not happen in the times where everything's smooth, everything's going well, and you're just investing in innovation. Think about the last 3 years. Every nonprofit leader that I've talked to has gone through some version of crisis, having to do with the pandemic or the way their programs had to be reinvented during the pandemic. And so I don't mean to make light of that, by the way. I don't mean to be unempathetic, but the reality is crisis presents an opportunity. In fact, did you know that the Chinese word for crisis is made up of 2 characters? The first is danger, and the second is opportunity. Now, if Chinese glyphs are not your thing, I would like to quote the philosophers Lisa and Homer Simpson. In an episode of The Simpsons, when Lisa explains this reality to Homer, she says that, did you know that the Chinese use the same word for crisis as they do for opportunity? And Homer, in his very Homer way, responds, that's it, it's a crisis-tunity. So I would ask you the question, what is your crisis-tunity? What is your crisis that presents an opportunity? Are you going through a difficult, intractable issue right now, have you gone through, that have required you to think differently about the way that you do things? I'm going to tell you a story about a friend of mine. His name is David. And in 2007, David worked at this little company called AT&T. And there was something that was happening in 2007 that was about to change the world. And it had a lot to do with this guy who was standing on a stage in Cupertino, California, talking about this revolutionary new device that they had invented at this Apple Computers. And that was an iPod, a phone, and an internet device in one. Do you remember the first iPhone? if you, by the way, owned one of the first iPhones, shout that out in the chat, because mad respect to you, because I think I'm a pretty late adopter. I was several versions into the iPhone. But nobody knew in 2007 how the world was about to change, and largely sparked by this device called the iPhone. But you know what my friend David at AT&T was thinking about in 2007? Because AT&T had the contract, the exclusive contract for this new device. He was thinking about these little guys, these cell phone towers, because until that moment in 2007, the idea of using cellular devices to use data on the internet was relatively unheard of. The only things that people were using mobile phones for on the internet were to send and receive emails via their BlackBerry. But in 2007, they were on the precipice of a massive increase in bandwidth, and the cellular towers were not ready for that. So David and his team were in full-fledged crisis mode. In fact, just to geek out for a little moment, do you know how much cellular data usage was into the year 2007? 2.4 gigabytes per month. Now, by the way, some of you have been streaming, maybe cellular today. You've probably used 2.4 gigabytes on your device today. The entire United States internet traffic via mobile devices in 2007 was 2.4 gigabytes a month. That is nothing. Over the next 3 years, which was the window of time that David and his team had an exclusive window on the AT&T deal, the increase in bandwidth was tremendous. By the way, this chart goes all the way to 2017. So you actually don't even get to the middle of the chart where you can hardly even see the bars with what was creating such a huge crisis at AT&T. The reality is, by the end of that 3-year window, they were running 292 gigabytes per month, which again, in today's terms, like, okay, that's whatever, that's not that much. But that is a 120x increase in 3 years, starting in September of 2007. So his team back at the offices at AT&T were in full-fledged crisis mode. They were inventing new ways of dealing with data and acquiring bandwidth from other providers. It was, as David describes it, one of the most difficult times in his career, and we were all just happy to have an iPhone. Now, David today, the cool thing about David's story is that he's at a nonprofit in Dallas that uses internet and mobile technology to accomplish their mission. So David tells me today that that time in 2007, while it was a very difficult time in his career, caused some amazing new ways of approaching things that ultimately have benefited the world that he lives in today, in the world of charities. So at AT&T, it was a full-fledged crisis-opportunity. So again, I'd ask the question, what is your crisis-opportunity? Are you going through something right now? And again, I don't mean to make light of that, but often that presents an opportunity for innovation. And how can you take advantage of that? As they say, don't waste a good crisis. By the way, just as an aside before we move on to our last lesson in innovation, do you know how much cellular data usage is per month this past year in 2022? Remember, we went from 2.4 gigabytes to 292 gigabytes. In 2022, it's this much per month. That is 99 billion gigabytes, by the way, which I believe is an exabyte. So we're now in the exabyte world per month. So can you imagine being able to create the innovations that are required to hold that kind of bandwidth? It's pretty incredible. So, myth is that innovation happens when times are good. But the truth is that innovation, if necessity is the mother of invention, then crisis is the mother of innovation. And so don't waste a good crisis. Lean into it. I know it's difficult. You have to surround yourself with collaboration and push forward. The last myth that I'm going to cover today is that innovation comes from the experts. Now, I'm on stage, purportedly an expert here, telling you that innovation does not come from the experts. Let me unpack what I mean by that. There's a problem with expertise. And the problem with expertise, for me and for you, is that the better we get, the more expert we become at our given field, the more we tend to rely on our own expertise. In fact, there's this weird paradox that happens where the more expert any person becomes, the more confident they are that their expertise is the solution to the problem, and the more narrow their field of view becomes to what the actual solutions to the problems might be. In other words, if you've got a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail, right? So, and this is not one person is not immune from the realities that the more expert we become, the narrower our field of view becomes. And so we're going to talk about some ways to flip that. Let me tell you a story in the medical profession. I remember the first time I realized that doctors were essentially consultants with a lot of knowledge about medical issues. I've been a consultant for many years, and I realized that sometimes I might be wrong. But to think that a medical professional might actually be wrong. So in his book, Range, author David Epstein tells a story about medical professionals, and it's such a good excerpt that I'm going to read it to you. Interventional cardiologists, for example, specialize in treating chest pain by placing stents, a metal tube that pries open blood vessels. The problem is that interventional cardiologists are seeing and treating just one tiny part of a complicated system. And it turns out that evidence shows that treating one blocked pipe often doesn't help. Despite this evidence, cardiologists who specialize in using that tool reported that they simply cannot believe that stenting doesn't work, even when their compensation was not tied to performing the procedure. Being told, and this is the key quote here, being told to stop using stents was like being told to forget that you're an interventional cardiologist. Think about your own field, right? Our tools are X, our CRM is Y, so therefore this is how we behave. That's one of the things I really appreciate about what Virtuous is trying to do in the area of CRM and in applications. A 2015 study found that patients with heart failure or cardiac arrest, and this is a little shocking, were less likely to die if they were admitted to the hospital during a national cardiology conference when thousands of top cardiologists were away. So that's a little sobering. Now, am I saying don't go to medical professionals if you have a medical issue? If you need open heart surgery, go to the guy or the gal who has done 2,000 open heart surgeries. That's not what I'm saying. Expertise is a beautiful thing. You have expertise, I have expertise. But the thing we have to realize is that we have a very specific perspective on the world, and that is not the only reality. So the more you step into situations where you need breakthrough thinking, where you have an intractable problem, the less conventional expertise is going to be helpful in figuring out the solution to that problem. So what do we do about this? We've got to cultivate what I call outside thinking, okay? I'm going to read you one more quote and then a little bit at length, and then we'll talk about who this is. So as an artist, he was notoriously inefficient. Most of his work was left uncompleted as he often found himself sidetracked by his other interests. Almost always, he found himself diving down rabbit holes completely unrelated to his work, but being pulled by his insatiable curiosity. Once, he became so fascinated with the movement of water, he wrote a 72-page treatise on the subject. He wanted to understand all sorts of things. What causes people to yawn? What makes the sky blue? How to square a circle? And the function of a human heart. His to-do list, get this, included things like studying the tongue of a woodpecker, the muscles of a face, the light of a moon, and the edges of shadows. He found great joy in finding the linkages between wildly diverse topics that took his interest. He used his observations in one area to inform his creations in another. This was only possible because he allowed himself the liberty to jump down areas of interest that at times might have seemed like distractions. Have you figured out who we're talking about? I mentioned him earlier, Mr. Leonardo da Vinci. So again, lessons I think we can learn. I'm going to share one quote, and that quote that I shared before was from a book, the biography of Leonardo da Vinci by Walter Isaacson. But Leonardo da Vinci was fascinated by things like the function of the human heart, the inner workings of a mechanical hoist, or the flow of water. Oh, and by the way, I understand that he painted too, and people know Leonardo da Vinci as the modern Renaissance man. So this quote from Walter Isaacson, I think, sums it up well about Leonardo. In addition to his instinct for discerning patterns across disciplines, Leonardo honed two other traits that aided his scientific pursuits: an omnivorous curiosity, which bordered on the fanatical, and an acute power of observation, which was eerily intense. Like much with Leonardo, these were interconnected. So what I take away there is that Leonardo combined this keen sense of observation with a powerful imagination. And so when you and I are faced with an intractable or a very difficult situation, either our program is no longer working, our funding is broken down, we have to connect the dots. We have to look outside of the conventional wisdom, and we have to cultivate what I call an outside mindset. So cultivating an outside mindset is about surrounding yourself with people that have the ability to have a different perspective than you. They have different lived experience than you. They might have different expertise than you. And asking questions and learning about how you might apply these outside ideas to what you're doing today. One of the games I like to play is just a simple 4 words. And it's all about connecting the dots. And so one thing that you can do to cultivate an outside mindset is play a game that's just that reminds me of. So what does this remind you of? So we're dealing with this particular issue. And the more diverse perspectives you bring into the conversation, the more interesting analogies that you'll get in terms of identifying patterns or opportunities. So I'm going to give you an example. A few years ago, I've been in the fundraising space for about 20 years, fundraising and marketing. And there were 2 things that were going on in separate areas of my life. First, in the fundraising space, we were continuing to struggle to get donors to give another single gift. The retention rates were declining. Single gift rates were declining. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you with the reports this last year. But that was a struggle. At the same time, I started to notice that what was happening in the subscription space was really changing the business world, and that we had entered what is now known as the subscription economy. And so I asked the question, I wonder if we could actually connect the dots, because subscriptions are a lot like recurring giving. They actually seem like they have a lot in common. And so I've written extensively now on what I call subscription philanthropy and how the subscription economy is actually transforming not just consumer behavior, but donor behavior. And that's just simply through this idea of saying, okay, what does this remind me of? So I do that in 2 specific ways. The first way that I challenge myself to cultivate an outside mindset is that I write a weekly report. It's called the Wave Report. And it's all about the waves that are coming and what are the trends and lessons that leaders can learn from in terms of innovation, in terms of applying. And so this is honestly a little, taking my own medicine, just learning about what's happening in things like artificial intelligence, the world of work, what's happening with the subscription economy, and then what are lessons that nonprofit leaders can take and apply to the work that they are doing. So I write that, comes out every Friday morning. And like I said, last week was about the world of hybrid and remote work and how that's been changing just even this last few months as we come out of the pandemic time. This week is about the most recent online fundraising benchmarks and some bright spots I think we can identify within that in the area of monthly giving. And so if you're interested, you're welcome to join the list. But that is a self-discipline that I keep in order to cultivate an outside mindset. The second way that I personally cultivate an outside mindset is I host a podcast, because why not? I got an article from a friend the other day that says, meet Joe, the last guy on earth who doesn't have a podcast. And I thought, oh, that's true. But started a podcast a couple of years ago. We're just wrapping up season 2 and we're entering into season 3. And the idea of the podcast, which is called the Purpose and Profit Podcast, is to cultivate the ideas at the intersection of causes and brands. What can we learn from people like the global brand manager at Oreo Cookies about how to bring the ability for Oreo to create the idea of love around its brand, and how can we introduce that into the cause space? And then what can we learn, what can we bring from the cause space to the for-profit corporate space? And so it's really fun. We've talked about things like the NBA and the NFL and what's happened with the Super Bowl. And we've covered a lot of really interesting things, but it's all about cultivating that outside mindset. So those are two things that I use that are readily available. But I would just encourage you to cultivate diverse relationships, to realize that innovation doesn't just come from the experts, that the more intractable the problem, the bigger change that you need to see happen in the world, the more you need to cultivate an outside mindset, because innovation requires outside thinking. Now, as we wrap up, we're going to have just a couple of minutes for questions. So if you have any, make sure you're entering those in the chat. But I want you to just think about these questions related to the last point, and that is, what difficult problem are you facing? You might feel like you're facing a lot of problems. Just focus on one. What's the biggest, most acute challenge that you face today? That thing that you just can't figure out, or that your organization is face to face with today. And then ask yourself the question, how can you tap into outside thinking? How can you cultivate that outside mindset, that outside perspective? So we've talked about how innovation is not just about ideas, but it's about activation and execution. We looked at the working genius model. We've talked about how innovation is ancient. It's not new. Innovation is really often most fertile in the areas where we have crisis. And then last is that innovation requires cultivating an outside mindset. I'm going to close with this. I believe that we are made to innovate. I think we're all on a journey of understanding who we were made to be, and then what context we've been placed in. And in light of that context, what do we do as a result? So think about your be for a moment. Who are you? What are your gifts? What are your talents? What are the experiences that you've had? What are your weaknesses? I think so often we talk about strengths. I'm a huge fan of strengths, but we have to understand that we are also made with weaknesses. We need others. We need to be surrounded in community. What's your context? What time in history were you born in? What country were you born in? What region? What experiences that you have had growing up, both the good ones and the bad ones, the ones that have shaped your passion and what you're wired to do. And then in that intersection, I believe the consistent question that each of us are asking, that I'm asking, that I believe each of us should be asking is, what do we do in that intersection? So you're called to innovate, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. That was amazing.
Hey, Tim.
We've got a couple of questions here that I just wanted to throw your way. So first one is, what are your working genius areas?
Oh, what are my working geniuses? So I have the genius of wonder. If you haven't figured that out, since this presentation has been all over the place, that's wonder. My outlet for the Wave report is often that genius of wonder. It's like, what's happening in the world of work? What's happening with subscriptions? What's happening with technology? And then my second genius is the genius of discernment. And that's not just the wondering, but does it matter?
Yeah.
And I will share for people that have those. That's a real tension, because you feel like, does this even matter? Am I just like head in the clouds? So I use the genius of discernment with clients and with my writing to say, like, what actually matters, and how can I cut down the big picture to the discernment?
I think you just answered the second question I had, which was, innovation is a group project. How do you know if you're onto something? And I think you find a discerner and you ask them.
Amen.
All right.
And
great.
by the way, even if you have, like, I have the genius of discernment, that doesn't mean that I'm really great at discerning my own ideas. I think people that have the genius of invention and the genius of discernment can actually get themselves in trouble, because they're like, well, I created the idea and I discerned it, so I think it's awesome.
Yep.
So some of us need to get outside perspective.
Yeah.
So it's super helpful.
Okay. And when you write the Wave report, which is amazing, and I'm signing up, where are you sourcing content? Where do you find those ideas?
So the reason I write the Wave report is actually because of that question that I received about a year ago from a friend who said, Dave, how the heck do you keep up with all this stuff? And I was like, I don't know. I read. And so for me, I am constantly, literally, I spend, I'm partly with Imago Consulting. It's my day job. So I spend hours actually culling through what's happening. But I would say I have a few key even newsletters and reports that I read and I subscribe to. And they often are a source of inspiration to say, you know what, this is a repeated pattern. I wonder if I should delve deeper into that.
Got it. Okay, how do organizations get in the way of their own innovations, like block their own innovation? What actions do they do?
So I would say two opposite, these are great questions, by the way. Two opposite reactions. Number one is they create what I would call an innovation bureaucracy. This is a term I learned actually from my former boss who was at a very large nonprofit called World Vision. And they were incessant about in the early years about not creating too much structure about innovation. There's this weird thing with innovation where you have to like have some unstructured, crazy idea time. But then you need people like me who are very type A and like are like, no, we don't just stay in idea land. We have to actually build stuff.
Enough
right?
crazy time. Let's get back to that.
So you can err on the side of too much bureaucracy, too much structure, but I also see that, well, you know, innovation is like, it's like a sensitive thing. So we can't really structure innovation too much. And so they actually do too little structure around innovation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Last question here. Do you have ways to develop an outside mindset for yourself in your own field?
Yeah, so ways to develop an outside mindset in your own field. I would say, well, you're literally at the Responsive Nonprofit Summit, so way number one. I would also say go to in-person events as well. It's wonderful, and I'm encouraging developing relationships, and I think that can happen in the chat. I think you can connect with people on LinkedIn and then have human-to-human connections. But I highly, highly recommend just meeting a couple people. Tim, you and I literally met this week. I've followed you for a while. And you and I have a connection now that I'm going to follow up on because I value your discernment and the way you think about things.
Absolutely. And I think we'll end with that. Thank you so much. This was amazing. Thanks for attending.
Good stuff. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Beautiful, y'all. Wonderful job. We are going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then we will come back to the main stage for our closing remarks. We're going to highlight all of our learnings, and we want to ask you, what are you learning? What are your key takeaways? And what's top of mind? And we'll give you a little sneak peek into what's to come tomorrow. And don't forget, subscribe to the Wave Report. Dave, Tim, thanks so much. We'll see you back here in 5.